So if you have your Bibles, turn in them to Acts chapter 22. And we're going to read from Acts chapter 22, verse 30 to Acts 23, verse 10. So not too long, but to give you a bit of a recap, Paul has found himself in Jerusalem through a series of unfortunate events. He found himself getting beat up by the Jewish crowd, and now he's detained by the Roman guard. And the Roman guard is trying to figure out what's going on here. He's like, why are these guys so hateful towards Paul? And Paul was just trying to bring money from the Gentile churches into the Jerusalem churches to show them that, hey, we're all in this together, but nobody really, knew what was, going on. The Jews did not want to share their Messiah with anybody. So anyways, that being said, we find that Paul now talks to the Roman commander and he says, hey, can I speak to this crowd? He speaks to the crowd and he delivers one of the most powerful and profound gospel messages ever. And then at the end, he reiterates that this message is for the Gentiles also. They didn't like that. So they went after him again. And so finally, the Roman guard, because he didn't understand the language he was speaking, because the Roman guard speaks Greek and Paul was speaking Aramaic to the people, so he's still not knowing what's going on here. He has no sweet clue. What happens, he says, okay, listen, I have no idea why they're so mad at this guy, but he must be a bad guy, so we're going to throw him into the straits over there, and we're going to scourge him. And then after scourging him, he's going to tell us what's going on, because that's just how we're going to roll. And so just as he's bound up and getting ready for that first whip, he drops a bomb and he says, hey, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. And they're like, oh my goodness, we didn't know that, because it was illegal to scourge a Roman citizen. If you were caught scourging a Roman citizen, the punishment for you, the penalty would be death. So we pick up the story in Acts 22, verse 30, and we're going to read what actually happened. So verse 30 says this, then immediately those who were about to examine him, in verse 29, they drew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. So the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down before and set him before them. So in a last-ditch attempt to figure out what's going on here and who this Paul guy really is and why the Jewish crowd is so against him, he says, well, we're just going to bring in the Jewish council, the high priest and the council, all his leadership with him, and let them figure it out. And so Paul, looking earnestly at the council, he said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And then the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Interesting. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees, they confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take them by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. Now this passage there's a whole lot going on in this. And I'm going to try and highlight some points in the next 6 minutes or so. Not really. What's interesting about this is Paul is just a genius. Like, absolutely genius. In his last message, when he was preaching to the Jewish people, he's drawing them in. He's bringing shared experiences into them so that they will be following along with him. And he's just kind of got them eating at the palm of their hand. And then he drops the Gentile bomb. They didn't like that. And then in this whole, scenario where he's about to get scourged, we see that he, very cunning, he throws his, get out of jail free card. And he's basically saying, hey guys, I'm a Roman citizen. Bet you didn't know that one. Ha ha ha. And he actually saved their lives, because even one stripe, they would have died anyways. And so now we see, even in this section, he takes the Pharisees and the Sadducees, two very different groups. I can't go really into detail about that. I have before, but you can Google it when you get home. Two very, different religious leadership types. And what does he do? He has the ability to take the focus off of him and put it onto those guys, and he brings dissension between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And Paul's probably sitting off in the corner and being like, yep, that worked. Well done, I got them. It's absolutely, amazing to see how this guy operates. Now, as we walk through this section of Scripture, there are a couple things that I want to draw to your attention. And the first one is the reaction that the high priest had towards Paul. And this is very interesting because what I want to show you is how that reaction is very telling of the kind of leadership that was over Jerusalem in that kind of day, and how that leadership spilled down into the rest of the Jewish people, and why they kind of reacted the way they reacted. And so what we see happening is that Paul, he addresses them, and then all of a sudden, without you read that, and you're like, what's going on? He's addressing them. He's saying that he's got a good, clear conscience. The Lord has done great things in his life. And all of a sudden, the high priest commands him to be, hit in the face. Now, the word used here for strike is the word tupto in Greek. And this word tupto means simply to thump by repeated blows. Okay, so keep this in the back of your mind. Paul, the other day, okay, so we're looking at maybe a 48-hour time window here from when, even though for us it's been like 5 months, it's really only been about like 48 hours for them. So Paul got pummeled by the Jewish people, and then he's, detained by the Roman centurion and the commander. And he's now sitting in front of them. So the beating that Paul would have gone through the Jewish crowd, even though clubs and bats and knives weren't used, he would have been beaten up. History teaches us that he would have been beaten to a pulp regardless. Like, they go for the head. They're not just kicking his feet and kicking his hands. They're going for blood. They wanted to kill him. When you want to kill someone and you don't have any weapons, what do? Use your imagination. You stomp, you jump, you kick. So he would have been beaten up pretty bad. And he's sitting there. Now he's addressing, and he's sitting in front of this Jewish council, and the high priest is looking at him. He does his address, and then, the next thing, they just start pummeling him. Like pummeling. And you got to ask yourself the question, what's going on? Like, this makes no sense to me at all. Like, you haven't even been condemned for anything. You're just sitting there, and all of a sudden the response is boom, 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 boom. Let's just, make that face, a little bit puffier. Let's just make the eyes a little bit bloodshot. Let's just open that wound a little bit deeper. Why did they respond like that? So the last place that we can look to see a similar experience is in Acts chapter 4. I believe it's Acts chapter 4, verse 8. In Acts chapter 4, verse 8 is where we see Peter. Remember, Peter was kind of the first half of Acts, and now Paul is the second half of Acts. And so in Peter's first half of Acts, we see this same interaction with the council, the Jewish council and the high priest. And so even though it's the same interaction, there is one difference that I want to draw your attention to, and it's how each of them addresses the council and the high priest. And so in Acts chapter 4, then Peter, being filled with the Holy Spirit, he said to them, "Rulers of the people and elders of Israel." In our reading today, how did Paul address the council and the high priests? It wasn't certainly rulers of the people and elders of Israel. Paul was simply men and brethren. Now, although you're thinking to myself, Josh, this makes no sense. Like, it's just, you're looking at semantics here. It's not that big of a deal. Or, how, one addresses and how the other, not that big of a deal. But I want to show you that it actually is quite significant, and that it really was that big of a deal. Because according to Jewish custom, if you, at any point in time, if you ever wanted to talk to the high priest or the Jewish council, if you ever wanted to talk to leadership and have your voice heard or addressed in any way, shape, or form, it was mandatory. In fact, it was Jewish law that you had to address them as rulers of the people and elders of Israel. And so by Paul coming to them and addressing them as, hey, men and brethren, it was suggesting that they were all equal and on the same level playing field, and that the high priest and the council had major problems with this. It's as if, I've been to court on occasion for tickets. It's happened once way back when. And I remember having to stand in front of the judge, and I'm like, how do you judge it? Is it sir? What do you say? Your Honor? Like, I'm trying to be very respectful here because I want him to, like, knock that speeding ticket down. I want him to, do me a solid here. And I kept hearing people before me, and all that was coming out of their mouth was your worship. And I'm like, I ain't saying that. There's only one guy that gets that in my books, and Judge, I got respect for you, but I'm not calling you a worship. Like, sorry, in my world, worship is for God and God alone. And so I'm standing there, I'm like, I want to respect him, but I'm not sure entirely what to say. I think I said something like, Your Honor, sir, and everything was fine. He didn't really care. But in this scenario, we're dealing with a culture that was so set on these formalities. And by Paul addressing them as men and brethren, what he was actually doing was saying, hey, I see your title over there, I see your position, but by the way, we're all equals here, men and brethren. We're all on the same equal level playing field here. It's the same thing that Paul was doing with the Jewish people by including the Gentile part at the end of his famous message. He's trying to show them that, guys, I understand everything that's going on here. You've got this Jewish hierarchy, but it's not right. It's not correct. Yes, you may be the chosen people, but you're not the favored people. The gospel now is not just for the Jewish people, but it's for all people. And the Jewish crowd, they need to know that as much as they don't like it, the Messiah is for the Gentiles as well. And you guys sitting here, you might not like this either, but there is equality here. And together, under Jesus, under his salvation, we're brothers. We are men and brethren, to which they did not like that in any way, shape, or form. And they had major problems with that. So what's interesting to note is that the way the council responds to Paul's notion of equality is the same way that the Jewish crowd had responded when he suggested that salvation was for both Jews and Gentiles. So after being struck repeatedly in the face, what does Paul do? We often think that Paul would, he's getting beat to a pulp. You think that he'd learn his lesson and be like, Paul, just shut your mouth. Just don't say anything, man. Just take it and try and get through this. But no, what does Paul say? He just says, you whitewashed wall, like you struck me, God will strike you. So what does he do? He prophesies to the high priest, saying that God is going to strike him down, but then he throws in his face and he calls him a whitewashed wall. And now you and I think to ourselves, okay, a whitewashed wall, that's just Paul. He's upset, he's mad. And maybe back then it was a derogatory saying or whatever the case may be is, you jerk, I'm not going to say anything else because I'm going to get in trouble. But what I want to show you is that his terminology here with the whitewashed wall was not just a flippant comment. It wasn't just something that he said in jest or in the heat of the moment, but it was a very well thought out and articulated comment because it's something that every single Jew there would have understood. So the term whitewashed wall, it wasn't just, like I said, a flippant comment, but a carefully thought out statement that everyone there would have understood. You see, construction back then was not like it is today. For all of you, construction people, wood wasn't what they used because there weren't really a lot of trees in that time frame. It was all rock. And so what they did was a lot of their structures were built out of rock. And so, rock sometimes it doesn't look real pretty. So what they would then do is they would take a mixture of, I think it was lime and, I'll go back to my notes here, I'll tell you exactly what it was. It was a mixture of lime and plaster, and they would just mix it all up, and they would slap it on the exposed stonework, and it would, when they smooth it out, let it dry, it would look amazing. It would just look like a normal wall. It would look absolutely phenomenal. So this was how they, made their buildings look pretty because all they really had to use was stones and rocks and so on and so forth. So the problem in that day and age was that many people thought, hey, listen, if I'm just covering up the stonework anyways, well, then I can throw inferior products into that wall. And I can throw garbage, I can throw stuff, and it doesn't matter because nobody's going to see inside that. I'm just going to plaster it off anyways. And so one of the challenges in that day and age was getting the construction people, the workers, to actually build a solid, firm wall that was going to stand the test of time when all they were really focused on was how good this looked. You see, in the case of the high priest, Paul was essentially saying to him, that although he looked the part of the high priest on the outside, his character was far from it, and his heart was deceitful, and that Paul himself was not willing to elevate the position that he held over the person that he really was. So basically, Paul's saying, yeah, you call yourself a high priest, but I know who you really are. I see your heart. I know how you live. I know how you operate, and that is not how a high priest should. If you want me to call you a leader of Israel, then you better start acting like a leader of Israel. He called him out, and he said, all you are is this busted up wall with a fancy finish on it so that you can look good for the people. It's dangerous. Dangerous when we act like that, when our mindset goes that route, and it's even worse when we start elevating position over person. I want you to say that. It's dangerous when we start elevating the position over the person. Because what should happen, and this is how it works, the person should, earn that right to the position because of the quality of character that person is established, that person has been able to show. It's because of that quality of character that earns that person the right to hold the position. So the position really isn't the point, it's the quality of character in the person. See what I'm saying? I'm speaking really fast, but you understand what I'm saying? And so this idea of him calling him a whitewashed wall was Paul just saying, I see right through you, man. You say and you look and you dress and you got the part of a high priest, but you're no more closer to a high priest than I am, brother. And he calls him out. It's dangerous when we elevate the position over the person, and Paul was not willing to go down that road. You see, the authority structure back then was very much about the position, and it was the position that garnered the respect. Paul was able to see through that, and he was able to see into the heart of the man and knew what kind of a man the high priest was, and that he did not line up with the position that he was granted. I want to say this to you this morning. When our private lives do not match up with our public lives, then we run into whitewashed territory, don't we? When our private lives, who we are, don't match up with our public persona, our public display, the public facade, then we've got a problem, don't we? You see, many of us, we think that, okay, I've got this. If I just put on the right spiritual clothes, if I put on the right spiritual covering, no one's going to see inside me, but they're going to think that I'm the perfect little Christian that there ever was. Okay, I got to make sure I show up at least 3 Sundays out of the 4. Okay, so that's good. I got to make sure I at least give some money. I got to make sure that I park on the street so people think that I'm holy. I got to make sure that, I serve in kids ministry because only there's extra crowns and glory for those people that serve in kids ministry. I got to make sure I do all these kinds of things so that everyone can see me as a good Christian. When you do that, you're elevating the position over the person, and God doesn't care about the position as much as he cares about the person, because it is the quality of character within each and every one of us, within the person, that actually qualifies for that position. And it's a dangerous thing when you and I start elevating in our own lives the position over the person. You see, every one of us struggles with sin. We talked about sin this morning. We talked about the devastating effects of sin, but how God covered that sin, and we're no longer slaves to that sin. But the reality is that sin is still very much a part of every one of our lives. We have to deal and battle with it every day. But the minute we start making excuses for that sin, we're putting whitewash on the bricks, aren't we? The minute we start justifying that sin, we're putting whitewash on that brick, and we're calling it, hey, you know what, doesn't matter. No one's going to see what's going on really, truly inside of me right now. I'm just going to cover it up and, just throw out that face. Hey, like we do this. But God's call to us today is to take that which is a whitewashed wall and to rip off the facade and to deal with the bricks. Deal with the structure that might be a little weak and allow his Holy Spirit to strengthen that. You might be becoming a little vulnerable with your family. You might have to become vulnerable in your work. You might have to show that, hey, there's real truth inside who I am. And when we take that facade off, God reveals the true character of the man or the woman inside. And maybe that's what God needs to do. Maybe some of us, we've been wearing that facade for far too long. God's just like, you got to take it down. Because if you don't take it down now, at some point, someone's going to call you out, and they're going to look at you, and you're going to have this fancy gown on, and you're going to be called a whitewashed wall, just like the high priest was.